the working class who campaigned around factories, and especially around the factories which were armaments factories or which produced parts for planes, etc.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with a delightful music video from Ukraine.
Червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо.
Hard to believe that the unspeakable Putin has deprived electricity from 2 million of these people. The COP27 climate conference ended up today in Egypt, and Amy Goodman interviewed a Russian exile who has some strong opinions about a false solution: nuclear power.
I also want to say that here at the negotiations, it's great that we have a coalition of non-governmental organizations called Don't Nuke the Climate. They published a very good statement this morning condemning nuclear power and saying nuclear power cannot save the climate. And it's very simple, and it's very simple to describe why. First thing, it takes very long to build nuclear reactors. Like, for example, if you would be the country that decided to build nuclear reactors, you would spend close to 20 years from the moment you plan reactor to the moment it generates electricity. And we don't need climate action in 20 years. We need it today. I mean, time is running out. The second thing, it's very expensive. It's extremely expensive source of energy. It's much more expensive than everything else on Earth. And compared to renewable energy, renewables been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over the last decade. You cannot even compare it. And of course, the third thing in nuclear accidents. We all remember Fukushima 2011, Chernobyl 1986. Nuclear power can be extremely dangerous for people in the environment, and it should not be allowed to be an instrument of a climate action.
Vladimir Slivyak, Russia is the third largest supplier of uranium to the United States. Now, President Biden has banned oil and gas imports from Russia, but not uranium. Talk about the significance of this.
Well, I've been a campaigner. I mean, this year, almost the whole year, I'm acting as an anti-war campaigner. I'm going around different countries, meeting politicians, talking to media, doing public talks on basically only one issue, and this issue is stop war in Ukraine. And it's very important to understand how war in Ukraine became possible. It became possible because Vladimir Putin accumulated enough money, and he got enough money money to start this war because the Western countries, European Union and the United States, been paying Russian regime over a very long period of time incredibly big money for the energy resources, for fossil fuel, for uranium. And in Europe, where I'm mostly working now, we can hear a lot of statements about fossil fuel, and I think Europe's doing good about embargo for fossil fuel, but we almost hear no information on uranium delivery from Russia, and this is what I'm campaigning right now on. Well, U.S. is dependent on Russian uranium delivery.
And here's a head scratcher. Why is the Biden administration allowing American companies to buy uranium from Russia?
Europe is also dependent on it. It's almost 20% of uranium supplied by Russia to the EU, and it's another almost 20% supplied by Kazakhstan, and production of uranium in Kazakhstan is basically under control of Russia. So it's close to half of uranium that used in Europe today coming from Russia. But the most important thing to understand that it's still possible to do something with this dependence, and why we should do something about this dependence, for one very simple reason. As long as the United States and European Union continue to pay Vladimir Putin for uranium or fossil fuel, that means that this money will be used for the war in Ukraine. That means more people will die in Ukraine because US and the EU cannot stop it.
We have to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for being with us. Vladimir Slivyak, co-chair of the leading Russian environmental organization, Eco-Defense.
Recall last week that I complained about Ukraine President Zelensky's decision to congratulate Netanyahu on his election victory. Well, perhaps he heard me. This week, the Ukrainian delegation at the United Nations voted to bring the matter of the Israeli occupation to the International Criminal Court. The Israeli government is quite unhappy. We've been talking about an upcoming event called Anti-Nazi Germans, the Hidden History of Working Class Resistance, Lessons for Today. It's sponsored by Promoting Enduring Peace and the Women's Studies Department and History Departments at Southern Connecticut State University. It'll take place at noon Eastern on the 28th, the first Monday after Thanksgiving. It'll be on Zoom and in person at Southern. To give you a preview of the talk, I interviewed Merilyn Moos, who will be the chief speaker this week. We did have some technical difficulties on my end, and so I re-recorded my questions. I'll be speaking to Merilyn Moos. She is the author of Anti-Nazi Germans, Enemies of the Nazi State from Within the Working Class Movement. She's a child of German anti-Nazis who fled that country and made it to Britain. She's a lecturer and a writer and has been a socialist and anti-racist all her life. She speaks to us from London. Merilyn, in the introduction of your book, you say you wanted to puncture a myth, the myth that there wasn't any real resistance to the Nazis from within Germany. You say the resistance first came from the working class and only later came from higher levels of society like judges and the army. Could we start off with some examples?
You know, what happens soon after the Second World War is that the Cold War descends, and the resistance from working class people in Germany, just nobody referred to it. But in fact, if one now digs into the records, one can see that there was a minority, who campaigned from the working class, who campaigned around factories, and especially around the factories which were armaments factories or which produced parts for planes, etc. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, there was the group run by Robert Ulrich, who set up resistance groups in about 20 factories around Berlin, munitions factories. The better known group is probably the Baum group, and they're better known because they committed the one act of sabotage, which had terrible results. But they also campaigned around armaments factories, and Baum himself was Jewish, and he was part of a group of about 200 working class people who were forced laborers, and they organized within the factory rather than just being outside it.
When was this act by Baum? What year?
42. The sabotage was in 1942.
You said it had terrible effects. What happened?
What happened was they tried to blow up an exhibition, which was an anti-Soviet exhibition. And in fact, they basically failed. But after that, the Nazis didn't just try to get hold of the people who had committed the acts. They quite randomly arrested, I think it was about 200, this is from memory, but about 200 mostly men from the streets, and executed them. So it had extremely severe repercussions.
Could you give us some historical background about Germany in the 1930s?
Just to lay out some of the underlying facts. Hitler came to power, he became chancellor at the beginning of 1933, invited by Hindenburg. And that was the point that the Nazis started to organize against the organized working class. I mean, it was quite clear from the very beginning that was their first act. And then they used the Reichstag fire, which was only 1 month later, at the end of February 1933, as an excuse to arrest arrest tens of thousands of people. And I mean, they actually arrested many people on the night of the Reichstag fire. So that then became when the Nazi government really institutionalized repression against the left and working class organizations. They first banned the Communist Party, then a few months later, they banned the Social Democratic Party.
The Nazis put thousands of people into the concentration camps?
I mean, at the very beginning, there weren't actually concentration camps. It was more kind of holding centers. But within, I think it was a year, the first camp was Dachau. The first concentration camp was Dachau. And the first prisoners were political prisoners. Of course, some of them were Jewish, but they weren't in general arrested for being Jewish, but for being anti-Nazis.
Now, this is all German history, but it's also your family's history. Could you explain?
I mean, I am personally related to this story, which is partly how I became interested in it, because my father, I was to discover rather than him telling me, my father was a leading figure in left theater, what are called agitprop troops.
That's just part of the interview. To see the entire interview, go to thestruggle.org and click on the All Our YouTube Videos section. The Black Panther activist George Edwards died in September. His memorial was a few weeks ago, and hundreds of people turned out for food, music, and inspiration. Paula Panzarella remarked.
My name's Paula Panzarella, And this is really beautiful seeing so many people, and I have to say, I have to use the words I learned from George. I thank you all for coming here, all my family, all my friends, and the CIA, FBI, and all police agents in the room. I hope you learned something. Many times I've been at events, and that's how George would greet people. I went to Hill House during the time of the Panthers. They used to hand leaflets out when we'd get out of school. I don't know if my path crossed George's then. We'd go to rallies on the green. I don't know if I'd see him then. My dad worked at Sosensky's hardware store, 246 Dixwell. I'd collect money for the Biafra Fund. I don't know if George and I met then. But certainly I was aware of the Panthers and what they're doing in New Haven. After Hill House, I traveled around a lot, lived in Portland, Oregon for 10 years, and considered myself a revolutionary activist. Came back to New Haven in the 80s, and in the New Haven Register, I think it was 1985, there was a feature article about George, and it was like, wow. I gotta meet this guy. Had no idea how to. And a few months later, I'm selling newspapers, leftist newspapers on the corner of Broadway and York. And there's George. And we start talking, exchange contact info, and I'm thinking, wow, I met him. We'd meet, we'd talk, we'd work on programs together, and I felt like then I had, from George, a seal of approval, that was my time of credential of being a real activist, of being able to be with George, work on many different things. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the shanties were up for 2.5 years. They were staffed 24 hours a day. George took many, many hours of the shanty shifts, talked to so many people, documented the discussions in the log.
We have video of 1986, George Edwards speaking when he was opposing South Africa, when it was a full apartheid state. You'll see he walks among shanties that were built without permission on Yale property right opposite the main Yale administration. The video is courtesy of John Suma.
Well, I'd have to begin actually during the May Day weekend of 1970, when the National Black Student Conference was convened due to the efforts of the Black Panther Party during the May Day weekend of 1970 at Yale University. And out of the revolutionary call that came forth from the Black Panther Party, May Day 1970, one of the burning issues that surfaced out of the conference was the concerns that Yale University divest from all businesses and companies doing business in South Africa. We didn't know what Yale's investments were in companies doing business in South Africa. And so there was a problem in terms of where to begin to approach the whole issue of divestment. What the Office of Investment said was, if you're serious about finding out Yale's investments, then why don't you do some research, and then we'll have a basis for dialogue. And so that's what we began to do. Basically, we began as the Committee Against Apartheid or Coalition Against Apartheid. I'm not sure because the group changed names 2 or 3 times during that period of time. I think we began as the Committee Against Apartheid. Then we began to do research on, research trying to find out just exactly where Yale was involved in South Africa, which companies, you know, stocks, and you know, what kind of investments in which banks were involved, so forth and so on. And like I said, this was the fall of 1976 and on into the year 1977. Okay, after the Yale New Haven Anti-Apartheid Committee came up with Yale's some of Yale's investments in companies doing business in South Africa, we called for a response to that information from the Yale Corporation. Out of that effort grew the Committee for Investor Responsibility, which met with the Yale New Haven Anti-Apartheid Committee in 1977. And from that was created some dialogue around the issue of Yale's divestment.
George Edwards, presente. I just finished reading an autobiography written by Victor Serge. He was by turns an anarchist, Bolshevik, Soviet dissident, prisoner of Stalin, activist, writer, and novelist. He died on November 17th, 1947, and by coincidence, that's just 75 years ago. For more on Serge, I dug into the archives and came across an interview I did with a Serge expert, Richard Greeman, back in 2009. Now, you mentioned Victor Serge, and when did you first learn about Victor Serge?
I learned about Victor Serge when I was a student at Yale College, but not in any classroom, although I was a French major. We had a socialist club there called the George Orwell Forum, and with a couple of faculty members, and we were connected up with the Socialist Party in New York City. And among the books on the reading list was George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, where he talks about his experience in the Spanish Revolution in '36, and one of Serge's books. And so it was through the socialist movement that I heard about Victor Serge.
So tell us about Victor Serge.
Victor Serge is an amazing character because he was a kind of a revolutionary zealot, in that he was present on the scene and a witness to many of the most important revolutionary events in the first half of the 20th century. And he was a very idealistic man who, as a result of his opposition to every kind of regime, spent about 12 of his 57 years in various prisons in Spain, in France, and in Russia, where when the revolution turned sour and he raised his head in opposition, he was arrested and sent to the notorious Lubyanka prison and interrogated, but he refused to confess anything, and they finally sent him out into the wilderness in exile on the border of Asia, but he survived that, and by dint of the fact that he was very well known as a writer in Europe, and as a writer who defended the Russian Revolution and depicted it in novels and history books and so on, a little bit like John Reed, for those of you who can remember 10 Days That Shook the World and remember the movie Reds. All right, well, he was for France, a little bit what Reed was for the United States. And when they imprisoned him, there were protests among teachers' unions and among writers. And Stalin, in an almost unique gesture, allowed him to leave Russia just before the blood purges, when Stalin began exterminating all the old revolutionaries that had made the revolution.
So he had second thoughts about the revolution? Very deep second thoughts.
Very deep second thoughts, yes. First of all, he had been an anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist before the Russian Revolution. He was nearly 30 when he got to Russia, because he had been born of exiled Russian revolutionaries. So he was a red diaper baby, if you will. I'm a third generation red diaper baby. My grandfather, who was a tailor in Hartford and Springfield, was a member of Victor Debs' Socialist Party here before World War I. But to return to Serge, he joined the Russian Revolution realizing that there were problems, that the Bolshevik Party was much more authoritarian than he believed in, but he thought the only way was to join it and work from within. And that's what he did, until they finally, 10 years later, expelled him from the party and arrested him.
Now, was he also in Spain?
He was in Spain during 1917, when there was an uprising that did not develop into a revolution, and 20 years, and he wrote about that most prophetically, because in his novel about that, called Birth of Our Power, he says in 10 years, in 20 years, the same comrades will be walking down the same street, but this time we will have taken the city, because their insurrection failed. And it was almost to the date that in 1936, the working people took over the city of Barcelona, made public transport free, and as Orwell said when he arrived there from England as a volunteer, the working class was in the saddle.
And where did Serge end up his last decades?
He ended up his last 7 years in Mexico. He was when he was allowed to leave Russia in '36. He went first to Brussels and then to France, where tragically no one on the left was prepared to listen to the truth about Russia, to the truth that Stalin was exterminating the old revolutionaries and manipulating the communist parties in the West for the benefit of Russian foreign policy and nothing else. For example, in Spain, where the communists allied with the liberals to wipe out the collectives that the peasants had made and the factories that the workers had taken over, and eventually to assassinate people like Andres Nin, the old revolutionaries, the sincere ones, whom Serge had known 20 years earlier and had known as friends of Russia.
This is not an obituary, but perhaps a death watch for the latest capitalist bubble, crypto. Bitcoin was selling for $60,000 a unit last year. Now it's down to $17,000. Since most people who bought into the electronic energy wasting doodads did it within the last year, they lost money. Most lost money. Lots of money. Well, that's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.